Okay, this one. Okay, this one. No. Okay, so.
Shall we? Right, good evening everybody and welcome to our second last tutorial, and there's Peter also saying hi. Let's go to our PowerPoint and then we can continue with that.
Do you want to find out who's at Paro?
Could we just look at who's at Paro?
Type the name in group chat.
Can you type your name in group chat? Thank you. Hi Imogen, welcome.
Thank you.
Right, and then we can just go to the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Should we just try?
Okay, good.
Right, just an overview in terms of the previous assignment. Let me go to the overview and then we can jump back. Well done to everybody. Excellent work done, and it was very interesting to read all your comments. I must say I enjoyed that quite a bit. For some of you, still need to remember to reread your instructions and the assessment criteria. There were a number of people who did not do the second interview, and I don't know if it's just time that caught up with them or whether they actually forgot that there was a second part of the interview. And then also, if I could just ask that, remember to write your name on the assignment. It sometimes sounds funny on your own word to write your name, but it just makes it easier for us when we do writing. We just have another CLC joining us. Right, and please also remember your honor pledge so that we know that you abide by those regulations. If we could just go back to the overview for tonight. Just want to go one back. Doesn't want to. Right, we've done the feedback to assignment, your previous assignment. Most of tonight's tutorial will deal with preparation for your fourth assignment, the discussion forum, and then looking very specifically at inclusion education and then also information communication technology and social media on how it impacts on the learners in this area. And then we'll just wrap up with some guidelines and pointers for you. I'm going to just skip the next one as we've done the feedback, and then let's go on to your assignment.
Just before we go on, I just want to, Reobot, can you just mute your, can you unmute yourself, please? Reobot, just unmute yourself and just, is that Louise with us from there? Or is that Martha? All right. Can you
maybe just type in your name in the chat.
I see the Martha now.
Continue. Okay, it's up now. Hi Sandra, can you still hear me?
Seem to have technical problems.
Okay.
And then lastly, I'll look at your engagement and participation in the ongoing forum discussion. So please avoid just giving your input right at the beginning. Try and follow the discussion throughout so that you have an understanding of other people's point of view as well. And then obviously your critical insight will be looked at very specifically within these 4 components.
Okay. Okay, please tell.
Right. I want to look at the scope of this assignment. Obviously, there are many tools that can be used within assisting children, but we're looking here specifically at the more high-tech tools and assistive tools, so your electronic mode, and not so much the low-tech assistive tools, for example, a pencil grip, etc., etc. So really looking at a more high functioning or high technology tools that we will use in assisting the learners with learning problems. Please also note that go through your previous tutorial with inclusive education and barriers to learning as part of preparation for your discussion forum, specifically looking at the categories of barriers to learning and also the categories of learning problems as such. There's quite a detailed list for you, and I'm sure you've added to those lists. And then also please look at the guidelines for forum discussion within your notes that you got right in the beginning when you registered for the course. Those will give you guidelines in terms of how to partake in the forum discussion, and I'm sure by now many of you have done that as well. Briefly, I've just included those for you to go through. I'm not going to go through those email, but just as an ease for you to go through them, I've included them there for you. I'm looking now specifically at the role of information communication technologies with SEN, and it's specifically special needs education. The needs of these learners are so vastly diverse that we need to look very careful when we plan for the provision of these. So looking at a teacher would look at what type of learning difficulties she needs to cover within her classroom and then plan accordingly. Obviously, it's going to be very difficult if you have a different tool for each learner and to administrate that and facilitate that unless you actually have a helper in the classroom. Also remember that these technologies should support lifelong learning, and as a rule of thumb, it should be something that the child could also take home with them or have at home that they can access, so there is synergy between home and school. Then furthermore, we're looking at the main categories of use of applications, and we have 3 categories there. One is used for compensation, one for didactical purposes, and the other one for communication, and just a little bit more detail for each. In terms of compensation, it would be to help the children perform a task. So for example, a child who has, for example, a hearing deficiency, a hearing aid would help there, but perhaps also not just hearing the lesson, but also seeing the lesson. So perhaps the lesson on a tablet for them or pre-written for them, and that they can go through that in advance, that will help them. So it's basically to help the student control their environment so that they can take in and memorize more effectively in terms of their working memory, so that it does become knowledge that they can store in their long-term memory. It's also to basically recoup or substitute the lack of the so-called natural function. So look at perhaps children with lack of mobility, etc. Obviously, this would not apply to every category of learning disability. So once again, it becomes a very difficult task for teacher to look at very much so which would be the most effective in a class to deal. But also remember, this category covers all the learning disabilities. The second category in terms of use, and here more specifically looking at the didactical uses, once again a wide variety, but here we're concentrating on perhaps a tool that can extend the learning for the child through using a different strategy or illustrating the learning concept through a different tool for that specific child. Once again, we're looking at the unique individual needs of every child and at their pace. So sometimes a child can work on their own in terms of a piece of work that they're busy doing while you carry on with the other children in the class. And remember, once again, it needs to be a valuable resource for that child to be able to learn. I'm not going to cover it in detail. Once again, you can read those on your own. The last category here is basically in terms of communication. So looking at tools that will mediate communication, and I think sometimes this one is the most known category for people in terms of how to facilitate this. Once again, it is providing the child with learning or communicative disorders the best way in which to communicate to the teacher and to communicate his own thinking and work that he's done. Most literature would also indicate that it is also advisable in terms of learners that are geographically dispersed. For example, you yourselves who are busy with distance education. And then if we can think of sort of the well-known example in Australia where they have radio schools, etc. So they're using radio frequencies there in terms of mediating communication with children in far-flung places. A little bit later on in the presentation, I will go through examples of these specific tools in the categories that can be used. But just remember, roughly those are the main categories that we will look at when we deal with how to provide for children. Just going through some definitions that you will come across as you are going through and preparing for your assignment. Looking at assistive technology, that's one of the tools that you might look at. And assistive technology is normally defined as any product or technology-based device that will help the child to reach their full potential. And examples there would be a touch ball. For example, instead of a mouse, the child will have a touch ball device that he can monitor through that, or so-called touch screens, which are easier to manipulate for some children, specifically children with mobility problems. Then we're also looking at examples of keyboard adaptations where perhaps the letters are enlarged or not all in the capital letters as the tradition is. There might be overlays of icons, etc. on the keyboard as well. So various adaptations for a keyboard for a child to use, and maybe even a tool to tap on a specific key as well. Then there could also be software in terms of accelerated writing. And if you think of your cell phone where you perhaps have predictive writing or spelling that corrects you, there are similar software programs for children in terms of sentence writing, creative writing, and even in maths. So one of the, again, looking at software. Then also looking at voice-operated software for children where technically you perhaps, the child would use software where if they have impairment in terms of speech, where a computer program would activate that for them, or even a little bit more low-tech in terms of the teacher that perhaps records all her lessons for the child and he can go through that on their own again. And then just other software for children in terms of studies. You have a lot of dictionaries and mind-mapped software programs that can assist those learners. So looking at assistive technology that can support children in terms of their learning. Looking at augmentative or alternative communication, that's another area of providing children with tools so they can benefit the most in terms of their learning. We've mentioned voice output communication aids, so looking at those. There are other examples, for example, the picture communication symbols. It's a software that provides different picture communication tools, and then that could be used. Or the one that is used mostly in South African schools is the Makaton one, and those cover are quite effective for a number of learning disabilities. And then the bliss symbols or symbolics I've also seen in schools. Makaton is a series of icons, and if I can give you an example there, for example, fast food, the icon would be a plate of food and somebody running, and that would be fast food. And so yes, sometimes you need to, for us who are not used to what these icons represent, we need to perhaps make them learn them and get familiar with them. But children, I can promise you, are quite creative in using them, and it leads to quite inventive learning as well in the classroom. So look at those, and if you have an opportunity to actually go into schools where these are used, I would recommend that you try and do that as well. Another concept that I want you to look at in preparation for your assignment is looking at inclusive education principles. I'm going to concentrate on one or two in terms of this assignment. I think the most important for me is the principles of equality and non-discrimination, and those are enforced by a worldwide declaration, and as early as more than nearly 60 years ago. And from that, basically, our South African legislation has drawn up certain documentation that supports that principle of equality and non-discrimination. The most important in terms of the South African documentation, you'll pick up that they're looking at impairment, disability, and handicaps in terms of where the equality needs to take place or the non-discrimination needs to take place. And once again, when you come across these definitions, when you do your reading, look very carefully what is actually implied, because sometimes we seem to or appear to be using them in the same place that when we're actually talking about the handicap, we're actually implying impairment. So impairment is the actual loss or the abnormality within a certain function or structure. So, for example, a loss of good vision, or that the abnormality in terms of vision where the child might have tunnel vision. Looking at disability is looking at the restriction that occurs due to that specific impairment. So what would the child's restriction be in terms of tunnel vision? Or what would the restriction be in terms of how he would write if he has a lack of mobility or not a use of hands as effectively as the so-called normal child would have. And then handicap basically refers to the disadvantage that that child would have in terms of the impairment or the disabilities that would prevent the child from dealing or performing effectively. Just going back to legislation in terms of South Africa, there is the Integrated National Disability Strategy of '97, which also has a white paper accompanying that. If I could advise you to go and perhaps read at that, but it does deal with technology, but not so much information technology. So once again, perhaps go and look at that. It's not a document that's often used in terms of education, but might be worthwhile for you just to go and look at, because it technically should inform policy making within schools. And then also very specifically for this assignment, look at your education white paper covering specific educational needs and learners with special needs. In terms of the white paper 6, just some pointers for you to bear in mind as you prepare for this assignment, and perhaps that could form part of your discussion points. Look at the main principles in terms of an ICT policy for learners with special needs. main principle that I've mentioned already is equality and non-discrimination, but it might be access to or how it would be used for assessments or not in assessments. I have come across schools, for example, where a child has difficulty in writing and could not partake in an oral exam. So how fair is that in terms of equality or non-discrimination? Because technically you just assessing the child's knowledge, not so much the mode in which he presents his knowledge. So look at those issues. Also look at the legal basis of the policy. How legal is it, and to what extent can parents require implementation in the schools? There's one student who mentioned that in her assignment, and that was picked up by a parent in terms of provisioning in the school. Then also look at essential ways in which of promoting the infrastructure. So in terms of perhaps it could be funding, it could perhaps be a willingness of a staff member or principal to actually implement that infrastructure within the schools. In some instances, in terms of information technology, it can be quite costly. I know I've just set up a school in the Northern Cape where just our infrastructure for less than 60 children cost over R1 million in terms of providing iPads, etc. for the school. So yes, it can be costly. It can be a hindering aspect in actually reaching your the perfect solution. Also understand the main stages of integration within your curriculum. So once again, look at the curriculum that's in place, what is demanded of the curriculum, and to what where would you start implementing your technology components for the learner. Also looking at quality of teachers training, and we'll come to that a little bit later again. Some teachers are fortunate that that forms part of their training. Some teachers are also fortunate in the sense that that might be an area of expertise, of interest, that they develop those further themselves. So once again, how is it dealt with in the school, and who is selected to actually head up those infrastructures in the school. Then also look at the impact of information technology on the quality of learning difficulty learning. Does it really support the learner? Is it used effectively for the learner to gain by its use? Or is it basically a white horse, and it's wonderful to say that we have that, but it's not used effectively within a school? And then also looking at the conditions in which it could be used to improve. And then lastly, always ongoing, is how would you upgrade the policy in this specific field? Does our current white paper need upgrading? Would the school's policy itself perhaps need upgrading as they develop further, or as in terms of their demographics of intake of learners in the specific school as well? I think you've got rich ground, and those of you who've done pracs already, to perhaps delve into and just see what's happening in those schools in terms of these pointers and how it's handled, for you to perhaps discuss upon. Just going to the next slide. Once again, equality in education. Part embedded in this concept is that it's lifelong learning for learners, and that there is a sort of a global movement towards implementing ICT for learners with difficulties. Sometimes it's in schools presented, and you'll hear of schools that all the learners have iPads, but to what extent is the iPad used effectively for the learner with learning problems? So yes, it might be within mainstream education for the mainstream learner, but to what extent has it been adapted, or its use adapted for the learners with learning barriers? So look at that very carefully, and then also look at how, in terms of this implementation of this policy of equality, how are policymakers and decision makers looking at the barriers within the education system, and how can we look at removing these barriers? One of the big issues is funding, and then also accessibility. For example, it might be a remote area with no or virtual limited internet access. So look at those issues as well. You can go through this one on yourself, but also in terms of mainstream education, inclusion education, and therefore specifically how we would provide an technology infrastructure for these children has been neglected. So once again, the quality element is not always evident in schools. And once again, it might be schools that are well funded that can reach this target, but schools that are underfunded find it difficulty. It could also be issues in terms of training our teachers effectively to deal with this issue. It also comes down to fundamental transformation within our schools. We need to move to what we deal with in terms of the 21st century and look at perhaps shedding off old practice to a certain extent for learners as well. And then in the last paragraph, they're looking at very specifically application of these tools that we use. You'll see that I constantly come back to the application of the tools. It's wonderful to have the tool, but once again, it's how you integrate it into the school, how you apply it, how do you make it uniquely individual for each learner, right through the spectrum from your learners with barriers as well as your mainstream learners. Just in terms of implementation of ICT in your school and social media, it will apply to social media as well. At the bottom, and where you need to spend most of your time, is promoting the infrastructure and implementing the infrastructure. Secondly, and that's going up on the pyramid, is looking at integrating this into your curriculum as such. So here, looking at your general curriculum and then looking at how you have to adapt your curriculum for those children with learning barriers, and linked with that would be your provisioning of ICT and how you would integrate that for the learners. So very specifically here, if you're using specific apps in the school, are those apps specifically designed for children with barriers, or are you using mainstream apps for learners? And then top of the barrier of the pyramid, they would be looking at the training of so-called specialists in terms of special needs education, although nowadays it's virtually every teacher needs to be a specialist in terms of special needs as well in the education system. So just a few pointers there in terms of looking at how to include it into the curriculum and how you would go about it. So very first of all, you would start off with your infrastructure going to the top level in terms of training. Not that this is giving you a chronological timeline. Obviously, training in most instances happens first before you start looking at what integration aspects you'll look at, or your choice of apps or tools that you will use within the school. Just some graphics there for you to look at elements that you need to bear in mind in terms of planning for these learners. In terms of development, you can include implementation there as well, but I think once again, looking at the design of the curriculum for the learners, looking at the implementation of it, looking at constant improvement, and I mentioned that a little bit before in a previous slide, where we need to look at upgrading or updating what we are doing, and then also looking at how we are assessing these learners. If they are receiving their learning material in a slightly different manner, they also need to be assessed in a slightly different manner. So once again, those cogs are basically placed on an equal basis, but each of them, the one can't work with the other. So yeah, so it's synergy within those four elements of planning for the provisioning for the learners. Also looking at the so-called learning platform, another definition that we need to look at that is fairly new in terms of barriers of learning and providing for learners with special needs education. But it normally looks at a platform in a sense of how are you organizing, how are you mapping, how are you delivering the curriculum activities, and how, to what extent, what are the facilities for the teachers and learners to have dialogue in terms of ICT provision in the school. So once again, that would perhaps filter through in terms of your previous slide, where we've spoken about the design, development, improvement, and assessment, and to a greater or lesser extent, each of these learning platform items would impact on your planning for else in slide. Just let's go back to that one. so learning platform. I don't know if there are any questions so far. We're virtually at the end, so I am going to go a little bit faster. Also looking at planning, those are 4 elements that you perhaps need to bear in mind in terms of planning to cater for children, in terms of providing social media in the classroom or ICT tools in the classroom. So look at each of those in terms of how you would go about it. Obviously in your forum discussion I don't need you to cover the whole spectrum, but in your own experience perhaps choose one that you're most familiar with or that you can speak to with some authority or experience. Then also look just further some more, and I'm going to pull out the third one, the second one there, in terms of what is the content that the children have to learn, what is it that they need to know and understand. And sometimes you need to reduce that a little bit so they do have a strong basis to work from. So bear that in mind in terms of planning content for learners. I'm just going, oh, doesn't want to go to the next slide just a moment. We'll get to the next slide. Right. Next slide basically deals with assessment principles and looking at various components that you need to bear in mind. I'm not going to go into detail through each one, but just look at, there are 4 of them and what the other 2 on the next slide. Look at them in terms of to what extent do you bear these in mind when you plan for assessment, look at the assessment task, and also actual assessment of the learners, and to what extent do we actually meet these criteria to cater for children with special needs in the classroom. And the second set, once again. And then if we could go back to the very first concept that I mentioned, equality and non-discrimination, to what extent does your assessment criteria, your rubrics, your mode meet the principle of equality and non-discrimination. Looking at assistive tools again, just some criteria that will help you to select effectively so that you don't abandon these tools. Sometimes we get very excited about a specific tool or apparatus, but then it becomes tedious or cumbersome and we abandoned it and we've actually wasted money or it wasn't cost effective in terms of the school. So look at some criteria before you select and make the costly step of purchasing or recommending to a parent what they can or cannot use in the school. And technically there are 4 criteria, one of effectiveness, affordability, operationability. Obviously if it's going to be a difficult thing to operate, it's not worth its while. And yeah, I can speak of experience in terms of using iPads in schools. It's so intuitive that most children can deal with that fairly effectively, and there are an absolute millions of apps that you can also use for learners with difficulty. And once again, what you can diversify here in terms of the level of the child and how the app actually presents the learning content as well. And then also dependability, how long will it be operated, when will it need to be replaced, and how is it updated. Look at those issues as well, so that the technology is not abandoned within the school context. Just further points in terms of your discussion, which I've mentioned. The first one I've covered into quite a bit in the previous slides. Perhaps look at social approaches to disability issues that you could perhaps discuss in your forum discussion. What are the barriers and how do they hamper implementation of ICT in the school? What barriers perhaps need to be overcome in the school? And if you go back to your one of your very first slides in the previous tutorial, your barriers in terms of social, economics, etc., what you need to look at. And then also looking at the benefits. How would it benefit education in general, and then also specifically to children with learning disabilities? How would you cater for those children in your classroom? I've mentioned just 2 additional resources which I found very useful. Second, author Jackie Murray has also written numerous books in terms of using technology in the classroom for children with learning disabilities. So perhaps Google just her name to get more than her reading than the one I've given you there. I've given you access to an article that she wrote about the 9 mistakes teachers make in using technology, and sometimes we need to look at those as well, because it's a wealth of information and experience that she actually brings back to teachers. And then also look at Amanda Watkins in terms of what she writes in terms of a barrier-free information society and what that actually means for learners. Then, as I've mentioned before, there's a large number of electronic applications available. Just peruse the web and perhaps ask teachers what they are using. Join associations and see what they use most often, because they technically tend to review these applications as well. So maybe that would be helpful for you in terms of accessing effective resources and not wasting your money on the resources that in the end won't work. Just a reminder that your next assignment is due on the 22nd of October. Your next tutorial, which will be a wrap-up tutorial on the 14th of October. Please, if you have questions, please let me have them before the tutorial, then we can make perhaps a more effective preparation for your forum discussion that is due and needs to be finalized by the 22nd. Thank you for your participation, and until next time. If there are any questions, we have still a few moments left, so if you have any questions, you're welcome to use the chat and post those, and then we can deal with that. So we'll log off in about 5 minutes. Perhaps if any of you have questions. Other than if you don't have questions right now, perhaps email me and then we can deal with those. Once again, thank you, everybody. And let me know if you find the course interesting. Wait a few minutes. You're quite correct. There's a comment that the next tutorial is on the 13th and not the 14th. My apologies, it is on the 13th and not the 14th. I'm thinking I'm going for symmetry in terms of equal or even numbers. Doesn't look like we have any other questions. I'm going to bid you good night and reading. And thank you for the comment that you're enjoying the course. I find it extremely interesting, and sometimes I find that strategies that we use for children with learning barriers work just as well for children in the mainstream as well. And sometimes strategies in your mainstream you can just basically adapt for children that are experiencing problems. So yes, they're not mutually exclusive from each other. You can use them for both. So yeah. Thank you once again, and have a good evening, everybody. Bye.